Anyone who has watched my channel very long knows that I love to grow tomatoes, and I occasionally get questions about what I use for this or that on my tomatoes, so I thought I would just do this video and maybe answer some of those questions that haven't even been asked yet. Before we go on, I'd like to stress a couple of things. Whenever you buy something to put on anything in your garden, it's a good idea to read the label and find out if there's any warnings or precautions that you need to follow. And if there are, pay attention to them. One more thing. Just because something works well on my tomatoes in my garden in my climate doesn't mean that it will work great for you. So whenever you're trying something new, just try it out on one plant or part of one plant. Give it a day or two and see how it reacts before you spray all of your plants. That could save you some big headaches in the long run. At the very beginning of the season, when I'm planting my tomato plants, I use Diatomaceous Earth around the base of the plant. And I also put a collar around the plant to help keep cutworms out. And if you want to know more details about how I apply it and make those collars, I did a video on that subject, and I'll put a link to that below. Diatomaceous earth is the fossilized remains of aquatic organisms, and it is an abrasive, so you should be careful not to inhale it because it could damage your lungs. It's effective against a wide variety of insects. After diatomaceous earth, the second thing that I use on my tomato plants is neem oil. And I like to plant my tomato plants and then I give them a root drench with neem oil. After I plant my tomato plants, I give them a couple of weeks to let those roots kind of spread out before I do the root drench. When I do a root drench, I mix up the neem oil just as I would if I was going to spray it, but I water the base of the plant with it instead of spraying. And one watering can with some neem oil is enough to do 6 or 7 plants. One thing to know about neem oil is that it solidifies at about 75 degrees or so it doesn't mix real well with really cold water. About 10 days after I do a root drench, then I do a foliar spray, and whenever I spray the foliage of the plant, I try to cover the top part, and then I try to spray the underside the best I can. And whenever I spray any plant with anything, I try to get up early in the morning before the sun actually comes up, but it's starting to get light out. If you spray in the heat of the day, you can actually damage your plants. In my 1-gallon tank sprayer, I usually mix 2 tablespoons of neem oil and about a half of a teaspoon or a little more than that of Dawn dish soap, and that acts as an emulsifier. When you're using neem oil, there's one thing to make sure of, and that's that it gets thoroughly mixed with the water, and that's what the soap is for. And if it gets thoroughly mixed, it'll work fine, but if it doesn't, you'll end up with some of it floating in the top of your tank, and the first few plants will end up with not very much at all, and then the last plants will end up with too much. So just make sure it gets thoroughly mixed. Not only is neem oil an insecticide, but it's also a fungicide. This is Epsom Salt. I don't use Epsom Salt every year, but some years I do, and I usually use it when I have a small plant that just doesn't look like it's greening up like it should. Epsom salt is magnesium sulfate. Sometimes when you have one of those plants that looks like it's just not greening up as good as it should, a little of this stuff will do the trick. It can be used by watering the roots or as a foliar spray. I use 1 tablespoon per gallon of water. Using aspirin on a tomato plant sounds kind of weird when you first hear about it, but it's kind of interesting how it works. What it does is fool the plant into thinking it's being attacked by a disease, and then it automatically stimulates the plant to fight the disease even though it hasn't been attacked. In a way, it works a little bit like a vaccine does on us. I take one of these 325 milligram tablets and I dissolve it into the tank sprayer there, and then I spray down the plants. Aspirin is a recent addition to my tomato care regimen, and I only used it once about the 1st of June. Like with aspirin, I use fungicide as a preventative, so it has to be applied before you actually get blight or some other fungal disease. But one that works pretty well is copper fungicide, and it's kind of a bluish color when you mix it in your tank. And another fungicide that I've used before is called Serenade. And you can use either Serenade or the copper fungicide, or you can alternate between them and use one once and then the next time use the other. But no matter what you use on your tomato plants, nothing is foolproof. I try to inspect my plants every day just to keep on top of what's going on. And as soon as I see any sort of worm activity like tomato fruit worm or tomato hornworm, I start using BT. And BT is a bacteria that is lethal to the worms but harmless to us. Even though I start the season using neem oil, it seems like the worms show up anyway about late June or early July, and when they show up I start using the BT about once every 10 days, and then I stop using the neem oil. This is something that I don't use every year. It's called Pyrethrin, and I use Pyrethrin for beetle activity. It could be flea beetles, or what causes the most damage on my plants are called blister beetles, and I don't have trouble with blister beetles every year, but when they're active, sometimes they can do quite a bit of damage just eating the foliage. And like with worms, you just look for droppings, and that's usually how you'll find them. I usually use Pyrethrin as needed, so it's not something that you have to do on a regular basis unless they keep coming back. I use my little tomato pruners a lot during the season, both for tomatoes and pepper plants and other plants too. But the main way it helps reduce disease is when I prune the bottom foliage from the tomato plants. That keeps you from getting as much splash up from the soil, which can actually cause disease sometimes. And by doing a little pruning, you can increase airflow, which can help reduce your chances of getting a fungal disease. At first it might seem like this is a lot of stuff, but please keep in mind that some things like the Pyrethrin and the Epsom Salt I don't use every year, and something like the aspirin I might use once or twice at the most in an entire season. Most of what I do for my tomatoes is to keep insects in check and fungal diseases in check, especially blight, and I did a video on just ways to keep from getting blight. So if you're interested in watching that, I'll put a link down below. Feel free to share any tomato care tips that you have. And if you're just now finding this channel and you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. We'll see you next time.